Thank you for tuning in to this edition of Our Ventura. I'm your host, Joshua Lane. Our guest today is Dr. Carlos Pacini, a graduate of Cornell and a graduate of the Cleveland School of Chiropractic here in Los Angeles. I've known Carlos for a long time, and he's a very influential holistic practitioner here in Southern California. Carlos, thanks for coming with us today.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So, what is the topic that you want to discuss today?
You know, I thought what might be the most relevant and interesting for people is to talk about what I call the 5 bad things.
Sure.
So if we listed those off, it would be caffeine, dairy, grains, alcohol, and sugar.
Alrighty, let's start with dairy. What exactly do you mean by dairy?
Well, obviously we're talking about milk, cheese, you know, products from a cow.
We're not talking about goat milk or sheep milk.
Well, technically they count. A lot of people are less sensitive to those, but usually most people are doing cow dairy.
Right.
And obviously one of the big problems there is pasteurization. You know, it's a sad fact that you know, even people who are buying organic because they don't want the hormones and they don't want the antibiotics. The law, well, 80% of the dairy out there is ultra high pasteurized, so they're using very high temperatures and just really burning up the milk.
And what is the problem with milk that you see?
Very often the body doesn't digest it very well. It has a tendency to increase mucus production, and it's just a challenge for the body to handle it.
Are we talking now about children or adults, or children and adults?
Children and adults.
And so if people use cow's milk, you find they're congested.
Well, you know, if we look at the 5 bad things that we talked about, I mean, in my own story, for example, I never thought that I had a problem with dairy. And when I started studying with a man, Carl Coffey, learning about Touch for Health, and so I just moved off the 5 bad things. But he said something brilliant to me, is that the body has a tendency to sort of develop a callus to something that it has to deal with. You know, you play guitar, you get them on your fingers. You play tennis, you get it in your hand. And obviously, you're not developing a physical callus in the body, but if you look at retention of water and other forms of inflammation, the body, in a sense, has a callus-type reaction. When you get away from that, when you're not using those products, and then you go back afterwards, you can actually tell. That's when you can feel, because, you know, if I just kept eating dairy, I never would have known. I had to leave it for a while and then come back. White coating on the tongue is something very typical that will happen. Build up in the sinuses. There's all kinds of reactions that people can have.
What was the name of the author you were studying with? Touch for Health?
Touch for Health. It was created by chiropractor John Thie many years ago.
Is John Thie still living?
No, he's gone.
Because I know that at one time he was very influential.
Absolutely.
Are his children carrying on with that?
Yes, his son Matthew is still teaching.
Is his son a chiropractor?
No.
Okay. Touch for Health, wow. And so through Touch for Health, you learned that there were a problem with certain foods. Is that it? Was that what they taught you?
Well, what Touch for Health does is that you're testing different muscles in the body which relate to organs, and that will give you some indications about whether your liver's under stress, small intestine, large intestine, etc. But when you get that information and then you start pulling off of the 5 bad things, all of a sudden those muscles are testing strong, tendernesses in the bodies reduce, and you start feeling better.
Okay, so when you're talking about milk, you also mean cheese and yogurt and ice cream as well?
Absolutely.
And these are problematic?
Correct.
And if a person stopped using those, how quickly would they see, oh gee, I feel better?
Well, I mean, caffeine takes about 15 days to get out of the body, but, you know, of course, some people are the 1 cup a day and some people are the 1 pot a day.
Right.
So if you're on the higher end of the scale, I definitely encourage people when they're going to start, I mean, there's 2 things. If you're going to start experimenting with some of this and pulling off of these things, most people don't have a problem with all 5 of them. So let's say you're just going to work on one of them for a while. You might have to take it out on a gradient, because if you're a pot a day and you stop coffee, you're going to be hurting. So, you know, even reducing the amount of coffee you're drinking, possibly start switching to decaf, which of course still has caffeine. You know, they'll never call decaf coffee caffeine free. It's just less. So, take things out on a gradient, but you also have to be perceptive. If this is healthy and this is not healthy, and you do something and you go like this and you feel miraculously better, it's really obvious. But if you're here and you do this, or you're here and you do this, it might not be so obvious. And most of the public, they won't necessarily correlate. Well, I had an interesting situation where I was working with somebody with shoulder pain. I was getting her off caffeine. Shoulder pain was getting better. She came in the next morning, her shoulder was killing her, and I said, well, what did you do yesterday? And she's like, oh, well, I was eating Chinese food. I was into my second cup of black tea before I remembered, and boom, the next morning, the shoulder pain came right back with a vengeance.
So you see even green and black tea as being problematic for some people?
Well, I mean, it's a different form of caffeine, but there's still caffeine in it. And unfortunately, chocolate also has a lot of caffeine in it.
So you really feel that it's caffeine as a substance rather than coffee as an herb that's problematic?
Absolutely.
Is coffee the worst of the caffeine-containing beverages, or just not really?
Well, I think you can sort of make the argument that green tea, black tea, that they've got some phytochemicals in there that are beneficial for the body. Not to say that all of coffee is bad, but I look at it as it has kind of like a cigarette tar effect on the liver.
Wow.
So
wow.
It is problematic. But the other thing about caffeine is that it's false energy. I say to my patients, you're on the freeway, you're doing 55, you hit the accelerator, you're doing 75. When you do that with caffeine, you're putting on the handbrake. And where this gets sort of more dynamic and intricate is that I also think that because of that stress on the adrenals and on the body, people start craving more carbohydrates and sugars to offset some of that stress that they're creating by using the caffeine. So it's sort of a double whammy that you get there, because you get off the caffeine and all of a sudden, sugar cravings and a lot of things start going down. You're sleeping better, all kinds of things can change.
What beverages do you recommend?
Well, obviously water. I mean, for example, if I had kids and I wanted to get them off of soda, I would use something like a Pellegrino or a Perrier and put some juice in it. Mm-hmm. There's lots of ways to get creative.
Alrighty. And you feel that some grains or all grains are also problematic?
Well, what's interesting is I get a lot of patients that are gluten from primarily wheat, gluten sensitive in this country. They go to Europe and they can eat bread and have no problems with it. Wheat flour is not naturally water soluble. So there's a deamidization process where they're pulling an amino group off it to make it more water soluble. Mm-hmm. You've seen the just add water pancakes. The body does that naturally to a small percentage, but when you do it more completely, people start developing more of a sensitivity to it. And obviously, who heard of a peanut allergy, back in the 80s? Prior to that, there was no such thing. And now kids all over the place are peanut sensitive.
Is it because there was no discussion of it, or now they simply recognize it?
No. I think they've definitely found that it is becoming a bigger problem.
Peanuts are problematic.
Yeah.
Okay, so are you saying that a white flour wheat product is more problematic than a whole grain wheat product?
In general, but the other thing that happens is that if you're gluten sensitive, there's going to be gluten in both of those products. And so even something like oatmeal, which generally does not have gluten, it has to be processed by itself to be truly gluten-free.
And what are the symptoms?
Well, gluten sensitivity, fatigue, bloating, stomach irritation, generally bowel problems, but it depends on how far up the scale. If you truly have celiac, you're going to know, because people end up in the hospital versus to just having an energy crash at 3 o'clock and not understanding why.
And what are the most problematic of all the grains?
Well, corn, definitely. First of all, we're seeing the genetically modified foods. They're preparing for wheat. I was watching an interesting show that even some of the genetically modified corns are showing up in Mexico where they're illegal. Mm-hmm. So, and corn is an inexpensive filler. We're using it in fuel and all kinds of things. So it's becoming more problematic, but wheat and corn I would consider the two biggest and the ones to try and stay away from.
The two that, in your opinion, cause most problems with people?
Well, if you look at something like barley, which has gluten in it, mm-hmm. most people aren't exposed to that to the degree that they're exposed to the other two. So I'm not going to say one's better than the other, but from an exposure standpoint, we're getting wheat and corn all over the place.
So therefore, if a person was to listen to you, would they feel better if they were to rotate wheat and corn out of the diet, at least periodically, if they didn't cut it out? Would that be better?
Well, I think the best thing to do would be to go off it for a while, let that callus that we talked about go away, and then you can try it. But again, if you're going to experiment with this stuff, you have to be perceptive. You know, you've got to look for, well, I just ate that and now all of a sudden I'm exhausted, or all of a sudden I'm having trouble sleeping, or my bowels have changed. You know, as I said before, if you're not that sick, you might be less prone to noticing the change. But when I get somebody who is really ill and we get them off these 5 things, it's very obvious. There's just no question about it, because all of a sudden I can't get out of bed and now I can get out of bed. But the bulk of the population is kind of running around in a fog and not necessarily aware of where it's coming from. Oh, it's stress, it's my job, it's my kids, it's lack of vitamins. You know, they'll come up with a million reasons. But if you are sensitive and pay attention when you get off these things, you'll perceive a change.
And what about the use of brown rice?
Well, you know, I try not to be too hardcore about such things. I mean, obviously, to me, the 2 big ones are corn and wheat. I think brown rice in moderation is fine, but it's, if you're really, really sick, I'm going to pull you off grains completely. If you're somebody who just wants to feel better, I'll be more lenient with that.
Can people use digestive enzymes and or acidophilus to offset some of the bad effects?
You know, those will help, but again, you know, if you're going to drink battery acid and you're going to use a little antacid, you know.
Okay, that seems very fair. That seems very fair. And what about, I guess, possibly the most important thing to avoid, sugar?
Yeah, and you know, as far as sweeteners are concerned, obviously the artificial sweeteners, I've been saying this probably since around 2000, that I just had this intuitive feeling that diet sodas cause people to gain weight. Now the research is coming out, and of course, you know, the artificial sweeteners are crossing the blood-brain barrier. Maple syrup, I think, is a very good sweetener. A lot of people are hot on agave. I don't particularly care for it.
Why are you unhappy with agave?
There's you know, I study with certain people that give you information that I cannot necessarily back up with science.
Fine,
as far as double-blind studies, but that's, you know, and obviously when you get into white sugar and refined sugar, you're going to be better off with a non-refined, but you're going to be better off not using it at all.
So you think that agave throws our sugar out of balance?
Yeah, I think it's hard on the body.
What type of sweetener are you happy with?
Well, as I said, you know, maple syrup. I try and use, you know, raw sugar, not the brown sugar, but the sugar in the raw type of stuff. You know, and try and stay away from it as much as possible.
And what about stevia? Are you happy or not happy?
Stevia, I'm fine with that. Okay,
so on the maple syrup, what quantity could you use successfully when you use maple syrup? And how much in person do you use a maple syrup?
Well, but you know, here's an interesting question. There are those people that have a cup of coffee and they put cream and 2 sugars in there.
Right.
And what they don't realize is that if they use cream and 1.5, and cream and 1, and cream and half, you can start reducing your sugar intake. And when you get away from sugar, I mean, I've been off of colas for about a year now, and if I take a sip of one, it's like, whoa. So sometimes that distance will take away that craving and that need and that desire for those things.
And do you think that really sugar is the worst thing that people can eat?
Well, you know, one of the big problems with it is that it definitely lowers your immune system. You know, it obviously, when we look at what's going on with diabetes, et cetera, you know, in India, they don't eat meat, but they are using a tremendous amount of carbohydrates, and diabetes is rampant over there. You know, in the United States, we're probably getting the sugar in 1 day that our ancestors used to get in a year. So we're bathed in sugar.
So in general, sugar really is if a person was to listen to you today and decide, okay, I'll start somewhere, if they cut out or cut back on the sugar, you think they'd feel way better, say, in a month?
You know, obviously that's going to very much depend on an individual. Some of the people that I've worked with, it's been so dramatic pulling them off of these inflammatory foods that they've lost 10 pounds in a couple days.
Oh, really?
You know, I mean, it can be that dramatic, and you know, but sometimes it's more subtle.
Okay, that's very good. Dr. Pacini, if people would like to get in contact with you, what is your phone number?
818-620-0154, or you can find me on the web at Dr. Pacini, DrPacini.com.
And your practice is in Calabasas?
Correct.
Very good. Dr. Pacini, thank you for being our guest today on Our Ventura. Thank you very much.
Thank you.